Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Southeast Collaborative Online Conference. My name is Dorcas Davis, and I am the Director of Continuing Education and Training for Georgia Public Library Service, and I'll be your host for this session. Today, we're honored to have the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Associate Professor at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Nicole Cooke. Dr. Cook's research and teaching interests include human information behavior, critical cultural information studies and diversity, and social justice in librarianship. This event is sponsored through the funding from the Library Services and Technology Act through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Before we get started, I do have a few things to share with you. This session will be recorded and archived, and a link will be emailed next week to access the archived session. If there are other people watching this webinar with you, we'd love to hear about it so that we can have an accurate head count for our records. Please send us an email with the names of the people watching to your state contact person. So Georgia, email me. You will have an opportunity to submit text questions to our presenter. Please enter those questions in the chat area. You will receive CEUs for this session and other sessions included in the Southeast Collaborative Online Conference. Lastly, please look for the survey link in your inbox. And now I will turn things over to Dr. Cooke. Dr. Cooke, thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for coming this afternoon for this webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about edifying and decolonizing our LIS practice. So as Dorcas mentioned, I am the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Associate Professor at the University of South Carolina, the School of Library and Information Science. And so as part of the work that I do here at South Carolina, I do research and I teach in the areas of diversity, social justice, equity, inclusion. And what I've been working on for the past year or so is really talking about how do we decolonize our LIS practice. This started with me thinking a little bit about how do I encourage others to work with me to decolonize the LIS curricula, but I think that one goes hand in hand with the other. So very, very quickly, and I usually just include this slide so you know that I have a little street cred, that you're not just listening to some random person make things up. So as I mentioned, I'm at the University of South Carolina. This is my 8th year as a full-time faculty member, and that is after I spent 13 years in the LIS profession, primarily as an academic librarian, although I did have stints in public libraries and also medical libraries. I currently teach 3 courses, as I mentioned, related to diversity and social justice issues, and also have 2 books detailing diversity and social justice as part of LIS curricula and pedagogy. So before I get into the actual decolonization talk, I do want to just kind of preface why I think that this content is important. And what I have on the screen here is a screenshot of a commercial. And this commercial comes from Procter & Gamble, and it's entitled The Look. And if you Google that or go on YouTube, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And so just really to kind of recap this commercial, as you can see, there's an African-American man on the screen, and the commercial follows this man as he goes through his day. And here in the picture, you can see he's kind of contemplating what is the day going to bring me. And as the commercial proceeds, it follows him to the pool, right, and to the gym and the looks that he gets as a Black man in the pool. It follows him as he's shopping for a suit and how the salesperson follows him around with the presumption that perhaps he is there to steal from the store, right? So this is an embodiment of the stereotypes that can be placed on African Americans and other people of color, and how these stereotypes and microaggressions play out in real life. And so this commercial ends with this man at his job, and he happens to be a judge. So you see him on the bench in his robes, and then you see the different looks that people give him because clearly he does not match people's idea of what a judge should look like. So the reason that I bring this up as an example is the question that I throw out to you as library and information science professionals is, how do your patrons feel, your patrons of color? How do they feel when they come into your library? Do they feel welcome? Or do they think that you're going to follow them? Do they think that you're going to look at them as though they don't belong? Other questions to think about when they come into your library or your organization. Do they see themselves, whether it be in your collections, your services, or even your signage? Right? So we need to think about how people are perceiving our organizations and us as service providers. And as service providers, we need to be cognizant of, for lack of better phrasing, the emotional baggage that people come to us with, right? So folks are coming with assumptions and they're coming with fear that perhaps they won't be treated accordingly. So just to keep this as an overarching question and some things to think about as we proceed today. So getting into the content of decolonization. If you haven't heard of this particular word or concept, or seen the T-shirts that say "Decolonize your bookshelf" or things of that nature, decolonizing, in a very, very brief nutshell, is this idea that we should be valuing more than white men, right? And that is what Yvette de Chavez said in her LA Times piece that she published in 2018. And so she's talking specifically about decolonizing your syllabus, right? So that goes back to our LIS curricula. But I think anytime you see syllabus, you can think about LIS profession. So decolonizing your LIS profession. And what she means by not only valuing white men, we are living in a Western culture, North America, that values whiteness, that values affluence, right? High socioeconomic status. It values Christianity. It values heterosexuality. It values certain norms, and we've all been socialized to value and accept these particular norms as quote-unquote normal. So anytime you have a person of color or a woman or someone who is a member of the LGBT community, someone whose religion requires them to cover their head, or anything, any example that you can think of, we are essentially outside of this box. And so it is very easy for us to be othered or even ignored. So think back to when you were in school, and it doesn't matter, what age or range it was, because this is a problem across all of the educational systems, that we are taught, again, to value certain things. And as part of that, we read certain books. We watch certain films. We do certain assignments. We are pointed to different cultural events as things that are deemed important. And so if we are to decolonize, that means that we should be actively incorporating quote-unquote other voices. So voices of women, voices of people of color, voices of folks from different religions, right? So this is not about erasing Western culture. It's about adding different voices and perspectives. So that's what we're talking about when we mean decolonizing. So when I talk about decolonizing, whether it's in class or in my research, these are some of the components that I think are very much a part of this discussion. And so in our time today, I'm going to go over a few of the top four, the ones that are in red: critical self-reflection, empathy, cultural competence and humility, and very briefly, racial literacy. And at the bottom, I just want to point out that when we are talking about education and curriculum, there are various types of pedagogy that actively work to decolonize. And these are long-standing pedagogies. There are books on all three of these things if anyone is interested in taking a deep dive into these topics. One is culturally responsive pedagogy, another is feminist pedagogy, and another is anti-racist pedagogy. But again, we're going to stick with the first four of these. So when we talk about cultural competence, and certainly I could be on this webinar with you for several hours talking about cultural competence. Cultural competence is an ongoing process of developing awareness and developing awareness of people who are different, and developing that awareness to the point where you are actively celebrating these differences. And you can see that these differences that everyone brings to the table just make everyone better, right? So again, it's not about erasing anything, it's about adding and enhancing. And so cultural competence as an ongoing process or a maintenance process, if you will. So in some of the work and writing that I've done, I've talked about cultural competence as a multi-step process, right? You can be not culturally competent, you can be very culturally competent, and there's a range in between. And depending on the work that you do with your community and the work that you do to get to know that community, that's actually going to determine if you are maintaining that cultural competence. Right. So, for example, if I were working in the Chicago Public Library system and I was working at the Chinatown branch, I could be very culturally competent with my particular community. And then next week, maybe I'm transferred to the branch that serves primarily Somali refugees and new Americans. Right. So I'm no longer culturally competent because those two populations are very distinct. So I need to go ahead and learn about my new population and my new community and work on that cultural competence. So you can be culturally competent in many groups and many diverse populations, but it is an ongoing process of maintaining that competence. So also when we talk about cultural competence, we're talking about intersectionality. I'm sure many of you have heard that term, this idea that we're all different. We all have multiple parts of our identity. And this is what we have to keep in mind when we want to treat individuals as whole people. We don't want to just look at them as women. We don't just want to look at them as African American. We don't want to just look at them as Muslim, right? We want to look at the person holistically and as an entire person with all of their identities and characteristics. Another portion is empathy, right? So empathy is different than sympathy, right? So sympathy is you feel bad, but empathy is are you trying to understand the experiences and the requests and the needs of the people that you're with. So it's nuanced, but there is a difference, and empathy is what we're aiming for. We also need to work to identify our own privileges and oppressions. All right, so back to intersectionality when we all have our different characteristics. We all have characteristics that afford us privilege, and we all have characteristics that disadvantage us. And this is fluid, right? This can depend on the time. It can depend on the place. It can depend on who you're with. And I'll have another example of that in the next couple of slides. Cultural and intellectual humility. All right, so cultural and intellectual humility is really this idea that we acknowledge the fact that there's always more growth and learning that we can do, right? So when we try to do this work with equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice, we're all going to make mistakes, right? Because we're human. But it's about how we get back up and how we keep moving and trying to do this work. And so by you attending this webinar and going to conferences and me with you going to conferences and reading more on the topic, we are exercising intellectual humility because we know that there's always something else to learn. And then finally, just as a note, the lack of diversity in the profession. Many of you know that librarianship is primarily white and female, and as such does not always reflect the diverse populations that we serve. So all of these things are components of what we need to consider when we think about the overall process of decolonizing the profession. So I just want to give you a quick example. This is what I mentioned to you about intersectionality. And I just have 6 very basic common characteristics that people identify with. Sexual orientation, SES is socioeconomic status, gender identity, religion, race, ethnicity, and education level. So patrons, as are all people, are very complex and intersectional. Now, for the sake of time, I won't have you do this exercise in the webinar, but I would really encourage you to go to this site. It's edchange.org, or you could just Google Circles of My Multicultural Self, and the exercise will come up. And this is an exercise that I do in a lot of my workshops, and I do with a lot of my students. And think about the identities that make up who you are. And it may not be this 6 that I have on the screen. It could be other things, and you could have a lot more, right? This is just a very basic example. But it gives us an opportunity to think about who we are, because the better that we understand ourselves, the better we understand the diverse populations and people that we serve in our institutions. To finish up on this example, I just want to give you my results, if you will. And these are just 6 of the things that I identify with making me who I am, and there are others. And, you know, when I talk about identities and then we bring this into privileges and disadvantages. So a quick example would be my PhD, my level of education affords me privilege on a college campus. And in different situations, different scenarios, my socioeconomic status, my gender identity, my religion, etc., can also afford me with privilege with certain crowds, certain audiences, etc. Being an African American, which is a huge part of my identity, affords me lots of privilege, but it could also be a disadvantage, right? So on a college campus, I've worked my entire career on college campuses. And I've been a student, I've been a professional librarian, I've been a faculty member. But the amount of times that I have been asked if I was the secretary or the assistant, or if I was housekeeping, right? And I don't say these things to disparage my colleagues who work in these areas. But what I'm trying to point out is that people have very distinct ideas about when they see a Black woman on a campus, what role that Black woman plays, right? I had a gentleman once, someone else in higher education. I told him that I was full-time core faculty, and he said, oh, well, you have to be a student. No, full-time core faculty, and we went through this. He went through every iteration. You have to be an adjunct, or you can't be tenure track. I actually had to pull out a business card. I shouldn't have had to do that, but I just wanted to end the conversation. But just to point out how these different identities can work for us, can work against us, depending on the situation. And this is the same thing that our patrons go through as well. So a culturally competent librarian or library will value diversity, have mechanisms in place to assess their level of cultural competence, right? We don't want to do these things in a vacuum. Would hopefully be headed by leaders and instructors who are conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact, be committed to continuous acquisition of cultural knowledge, and develop ways to adapt to and embrace diversity and promote equity and inclusion. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just, again, to get us thinking about what a culturally competent professional looks like, and also what a culturally competent organization looks like. And they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can have culturally competent professionals who don't work in a culturally competent organization, and vice versa. So that leads us to additional questions of, for example, if you are a culturally competent person that does not work for a competent organization, what are the ways in which you can lead from where you are to do the work that you know that you want to do, right? So sometimes it's easier than others, and sometimes it can be a challenge. But there usually is an opportunity to lead from where we are, even if we're not in an administrative or leadership position title-wise. Okay. Now, I just wanted to take a little sidebar here when we're finishing up our conversation about cultural competence. One of the categories that comes up in the cultural competence literature is this idea that people are culturally blind. And really what that is people saying, I don't see color. And so while that might look good on paper, it really becomes problematic because what are you saying when you say, I don't see color? Now, to me, as a Black woman, it says that you are purposely choosing to not recognize a very, very important part of my identity, right? It doesn't make me feel better that you say that you don't see it, right? I want you to see it. And so by saying that you don't see color, you're saying that you're going to ignore perhaps your own prejudices and biases and assumptions, right? Because you don't see it, then you don't have to address it. It allows people to ignore the complexity of racial issues. You perhaps have heard someone say, I don't see color, as a way to shut down and stifle discussion. All right. It also implies that you can't fix something you can't see. It limits our ability to appreciate individualism and really, the beauty of other cultures and other groups as well. And it minimizes the struggles of people of color in today's society. And I would add, other visibly marginalized people. So, if you have someone who has to cover their head or some other visual measure that can other people, it also minimizes their struggle as well. So what can we do, right? So if we've decided that we want to be culturally competent and we want to decolonize and we want to do this work in our organization, there are various ways that we can work towards these goals. One is at the micro level, and the micro level is essentially what you're doing here today and doing in your own self-work that you do. You're working to understand interactions between individuals who are different from one another. You're doing that continuing education. So that would be your internal micro work. At the meso level, this is what perhaps you're doing in your organizations, and you're thinking about procedural equity and equal access in our workplaces and organizations. At the macro level, think of that as the societal level, and this is maybe the professional level for us as well. And we're working towards eliminating marginalization and subjugation in our larger society. Now, much like our identities and our privileges and advantages, this micro, meso, and macro work can be fluid and it can change from day to day, right? So this is not to say that from Monday to Wednesday you'll be doing micro work, and from Thursday and Friday you'll be doing meso work, and you'll do all the macro work on the weekend, right? So this is very fluid. You could be doing micro work right now in the webinar, and then you'll do something macro tonight. Again, just fluid. You can be doing multiple things at once, right? So just to point out, there is no one right way to do this work. To further us on this example, again, with the micro work, perhaps you're engaging with cultural humility and reflection. You're working to better understand the dimensions of power and privilege. You're taking risks to do this work. At the meso level, maybe you're working on community partnerships, or maybe you're working on programs for your diverse populations. You're perhaps working on building and maintaining your relationships with these diverse populations and your community members so they can tell you what they want and need, and you can work to kind of co-produce services and knowledge. At the macro level, you would be working in the community, and you would be actively working against systemic inequities, right? And I know that that's a big sentence, right? But if the example that I give for that is perhaps your library has policies that will allow patrons who experience homelessness to get a card or use the computer without a permanent address, right? That's culturally competent, and that's at the meso level. The macro level would be if we were to think about what can the library do to eradicate the systemic causes of the homelessness that the patrons are experiencing, right? So this is macro level is getting us into the social justice realm and has us actively working in our communities to enact change. All right, so this is a quote by Audrey Lord. If you have not heard of Audrey Lord before, she was a poet and an activist. She was also a librarian. And she says, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." Now, before I leave this slide, I will point out that I have had people push back on the word celebrate, the celebration of differences, and they'll say, "I don't want to celebrate this person because, you know, they're against my beliefs and they're immoral," or whatever word they decide to use. So I would posit and say, well, maybe you don't have to celebrate them. You know, that is your issue, your choice, but you do have to respect them just as you would expect them to respect you. Okay? All right, so I'm going to start moving a little bit more quickly just so we leave time for questions. And very quickly, I'll tell you how I've been engaging in some of this critical self-reflection and thinking about how to best serve diverse populations. And my role as a faculty member is to talk to professionals like you and prepare the future generations of LIS professionals to work with diverse populations. I had a class once. I was teaching reference and instruction, and in most of the classes that I teach, I'm the only visible minority in the room. So this particular class, I was obviously a Black woman. I had all white students. So for a guest lecture, I had another Black female, another African American librarian come in, and she was talking about how she uses hip hop in her library instruction. She uses it as a way to honor the knowledge and experience of her predominantly African American adult student population. They're returning students coming in at night. She uses it to build rapport, right? So she said she didn't want to have, you know, these very stiff formal lectures that would put them to sleep. She wanted to have something fun and something engaging. So at the end of the session, they would know that they were able to contact her with their questions. So when she finished her presentation, one of the students told her directly, "I don't think what you're doing is professional." And so we had to stop. We had to, you know, regroup and readdress. And what is it really that the student meant by she didn't think that this type of approach was professional? What it comes down to, and I'll spare you lots of my thoughts and feelings about this, is that she thought that the guest speaker, who was in effect decolonizing her curriculum by incorporating and valuing other voices and perspectives, this student thought that that wasn't professional because she was very caught up in valuing the Western norms that we are socialized to prioritize. All right, so because this librarian didn't search for Shakespeare or other white authors who are considered part of the quote unquote canon or quote unquote classics, she thought that this librarian was being unprofessional. So this is part of the decolonization that we need to do, both in the curriculum and in the profession. As part of the decolonization process, I'm also arguing that we need to become new storytellers. And by new storytellers, I mean that I think you all are familiar with the stereotypes of librarians: older white women, glasses, buns, pearls, you know, always shushing people, right? So when we have things that hit the news about libraries and librarians, people are always really surprised, and they shouldn't be, right? So if we are doing the job that we should be in terms of letting the public know exactly what it is we do and letting people know what our value is, This is what I mean by becoming new storytellers. And the example, I have two quick examples for you. This is Melanie Townsend Diggs. And at the time this picture was taken, she was working at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. And during the uprising that happened in Baltimore several years ago when Freddie Gray died in police custody, there was a lot going on. And her branch was literally across the street from a CVS that was burning to the ground in this chaos. And so she brought people into the library to keep them safe. And this also happened in Ferguson, Missouri the year before, another uprising after Michael Brown died at the hands of the police. And so both of these librarians would say, this is what I do every day, right? Like the news is saying that these two librarians were so extraordinary, and they are, and certainly in their own right. But they would both say that my job is taking care of my community every day, right? Libraries are about more than just checking out books. All right, so we need to be better storytellers so the public knows that this is indeed part of what we do. Another example, this is Shara Kowalski. And at the time this picture was taken, she was a librarian at the Free Public Library of Philadelphia. She's still in Philadelphia, but I believe she's an administrative position at this point. And she received a lot of acclaim for administering Narcan to patrons who were overdosing inside her library and also outside of her library. And so again, the news said this is extraordinary. And to a degree, at least when she was doing it, was more outside of our realm of thought, whereas it's a little bit more common now. But she said, this is how I feel like I'm taking care of my community. Now, does this mean that we all are going to administer Narcan? No. But what it does point out is that, again, libraries are about more than just checking out books. They are about caring and taking care of our community, and that happens in different ways in different places. As part of decolonizing the profession and also the curriculum, we have to be having purposefully hard conversations like the one we're having today. All right, so, this is a picture of post-Charleston and Charlottesville when there's been shootings and other tragedies. And at this point, we may all be less than 6 degrees of separation away from a colleague or someone we know that's working in a place that has experienced tragedy. It's just unfortunately part of the times that we're living in. And we have to be able to process some of this information. We have to be able to have conversations about how we're going to deal with this new reality. And sometimes it may be outside the scope of what we think we should be doing. Like I shouldn't be having this conversation with a patron. But part of it is also having relationships with people and maintaining those relationships. And if you see that someone is just so bothered and upset, why can't you have a 5-minute conversation to help them process? Or maybe they can help you process. And these are the things that also need to be reflected in our collections and services as well. And this is certainly content and conversations that I need to have in my graduate classes. So ultimately, this is all about transformative information services. And this was part of an article and a speech that Dr. Clara Chu delivered in 1999. And I think that what she is saying is equally as applicable today in 2020. So she says that transformative information services recognizes that information transforms one's reality and pushes one towards action for oneself. It applies to librarians because the model assists them to understand the social reality in which they work and to consider information services as a tool for users in the process of self-empowerment and self-learning. It applies to users because it identifies the transformative power of information. And for me, the key words here are self-empowerment and self-learning. And information can empower our diverse populations. If our diverse and marginalized populations can see themselves represented in our collections in services, that's empowering. You know, you've all heard the hashtag and the catchphrase representation matters. It really does, right? And as they see themselves, as they are feeling welcomed in your organizations and in your institutions, that goes to enable them to be able to engage in self-learning in addition to other things. But thinking about transformative information services. So now we have the section where there's some online things. This has been a discussion on various social media platforms. Someone on Twitter said, if you're going to decolonize the university, and again, instead of university, it could be library, it could be, you know, whatever your particular context is, you must address the structures and policies and practices that minoritize those locked out of those spaces and those trapped within, right? So this is, in effect, saying we can't just have diversity on paper. We have to have it in our daily practice. So it has to show up in our policies, it has to show up in our mission statements, and not only does it need to appear in those statements, it needs to be enacted in our daily practice, right? So we don't want happy talk, right? So happy talk is a phrase used to say when things are just on paper. We want to see these things happening on a day-to-day basis. Now, there are lots of ways that we can practically decolonize our libraries and our institutions. An example is, how do we diversify our collections and displays? We can do this implicitly by, you know, having a display of diverse authors, whether it's people of color, whether it's women, whether it's different religions, different gender identities. We have authors that fit all of those categories. And instead of just putting the books out, maybe we have, you know, displays with their names and their pictures so people know, you know, that what they're reading is essentially coming from a diverse perspective. So these are implicit ways. You know, explicit ways would be to say, we are having a Black Lives Matter display, and this is why we're having it, and having some type of explanation or even programming surrounding it. But there are different ways to do that implicitly and explicitly. Another way to work on decolonization is conducting an audit, specifically a diversity audit. So for those that work in libraries with collections, because, you know, we do lots of things and we work in different settings, what does your collection look like? Do you have a good selection of people of color? Do you have a good selection of, you know, whatever, you know, comes to mind? Our collections can be very colonized, right? Because we have lots of the classics. We have the books that belong in the canon. But do you have other voices? If you have a trans student in elementary school that is struggling with their identity and struggling with what to do, are there resources in your collection that could help them? And this could be passive programming, right? I'm not saying that the person would disclose to you, but would they be able to find themselves and see themselves in your collection? And this is part of the work that is done when we conduct audits. This particular article is about classroom libraries, but certainly audits can be done in any library type and for any type of collection. Something else to think about, and this is coming from pop culture, if you will. If you haven't heard of it, the Bechdel test. This came out a couple of years ago. Alison Bechdel was talking about motion pictures and films, and she asked, do you have at least 2 or 3 women in your film that have major speaking roles, right? So that's the Bechdel test to see if there's adequate gender representation. Similarly, there's the Gray test that came out in 2015, and that is saying when you're writing and when you're publishing, have you cited substantially at least 2 women and 2 non-white people, right? So it's one thing to cite, but it's another thing to actually discuss substantively, all right? So when you're thinking about your collections or your programming or your displays, think about the Bechdel test. Think about the Gray test as a way to kind of, move the needle just a little bit in terms of decolonizing our libraries and collections. Another example is Read Woke. You may have heard of this. There are lots of different challenges in this vein, but Read Woke, it was created by a middle school librarian, and she is challenging her students to read books that are have characters or situations or cultures that are different from theirs. Okay, so you can see some of the criteria up on the slide there. Now, I will just quibble gently with the second bullet point, which is give voice to the voiceless. Now, I would argue that this phrasing, although I'm betting it was unintentional, is part of colonized language, right? So language is also important when we're thinking about decolonizing. And what I'm picking on is the idea of giving voice, right? Just because you haven't heard them and have never heard from this population or this group doesn't mean that they don't have voices. You're not giving them anything, right? You may be amplifying, you may be highlighting, you may be focusing on their voice, but you're not giving them anything. All right, so we need to be thinking about our language as well when we have these larger conversations about decolonizing. Explicit ways to diversify the profession. And this is really, as a profession, we need to acknowledge our roles as gatekeepers, right? When we are purchasing materials, we make decisions about what to purchase. We make decisions about what not to purchase, right? So we need to acknowledge that, we may have our own baggage or our own, thoughts about why something is and is not appropriate. And so whether we want to admit it or not, there are many occasions and situations where we are gatekeepers, right? And so how do we change that? How do we make sure that we're incorporating everything that we need to? Another challenge is having the time to spend, right? This work is not easy, nor is it quick. And feeling competent enough to discuss, really hard topics like racism, systemic oppression, ableism, marginalization, decolonization, et cetera, right? So this is all part of, why we have these conferences and, why there's so many good books coming out in the last couple of years. And we need to be consistently engaging in this work so we'll have enough competence and enough confidence to be able to do this work and maybe even help other people do this work. I'm going to run through two quick examples of other institutions and things that need to be decolonized. Last semester, Purdue, which is in Indiana, the president apologized for calling a Black scholar the rarest creature in America. All right, because again, the accepted norm of what a professor is a white man. Right, so he was hiring a Black male, and I don't remember what department it was, and he called them a rare creature. He was fetishizing this professor, right? So that needs to stop. That needs to be decolonized. If you watch a lot of reality television, perhaps you're familiar with Gabrielle Union, a Black actress who was a judge on America's Got Talent. So they parted ways in a very messy fashion, but again, thinking about language, when this all happened, they immediately labeled her as difficult, right? So language, important, difficult, angry, all of these are code words, right, that are used to stereotype and marginalize, particularly women of color, but definitely people of color, definitely women, right? So thinking about the language that we're using and the language that we're seeing in different places. And then finally, in library school, right? So this is really what I spend my time doing, is trying to decolonize the curriculum and also decolonizing library education. This was actually posted by a former student of mine, an African-American woman. And what she posted, there's actually a short video here. And this was some movie that won an award at the Golden Globes. And the camera, for some reason, did this slow pan across the stage, and it's all white people, white men and women, and they were like producers and behind the scenes folks. And then you had a black actress and a black actor who were actually in the movie, and they were very far to the right-hand side, and they were actually physically removed from the larger group that was getting all of the credit. So I described this to say that she said this is how she felt in library school, that she was always the only person of color, perhaps maybe one of two, and she felt like she was always excluded, not made to feel welcome, and not made to feel like she was valued in the profession, right? We definitely need to address that as well. All right, I'm running out of time, so just really quickly, this was also on Twitter, and this is giving us an example of how children of color, especially black men, black boys, are stereotyped, right? So a white male patron came to report a black male outside and, suggested that the library call the police, and it really was one of their students, right? And they were having a conversation about calling the police on black patrons of color, because it could have actually resulted in harm, right? Because people sometimes lead with their assumptions and stereotypes before they stop to find out what's happening. So ending with some questions for you to think about: what voices are missing from your library or institution? Do your collections, services, and programs present a single story? And by single story, I mean like the canon, the classics, the things that value the Western norms? Or do they present diverse perspectives and diverse information needs? Does your staff present a single story, or do they present diverse perspectives and diverse information needs? All right, so again, this is going back to the diversity at our professional ranks, which also needs to be addressed. So how do you want to be remembered? All right, so I'll leave you with that. When you are doing this work in the library and information science profession, how do you want to be remembered? Do you want someone to say, "Oh, they were fine, but I never thought that they really valued me, or that they didn't really like me, or what have you"? Or do you want to be remembered in saying, well, this is the person that gave me the book, the book that changed my life, right? So it's, some of these are very small actions, some of them are very large actions, but just thinking about the legacy that we leave as information professionals, because we are dealing with human beings. We are dealing with very impressionable people. We're dealing with people who need our help, right? And so we can really make or break their experiences in the library. And then, are you helping or are you hurting, right? Think back to that opening video and think back to the opening question about how do your patrons feel when they enter your library or organization? If you want to learn about a culture, listen to their stories. And if you want to change a culture, change the stories. So again, we need to be changing that story about who we are as a profession, who we are as professionals, and also the services and the information collections, et cetera, that we provide. And empowerment comes from ideas. So with that, I want to thank you so much for joining this afternoon, and I hope that this was helpful. Happy to have any questions, and hope that we can continue this conversation in this initiative of decolonizing the curriculum and also our profession.
This was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooke. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll get them forwarded to Dr. Cooke. We'll wait a few minutes just in case someone's typing.
And while people are typing, I have a handout for today's session. Dorcas, could I send that to you, and maybe it could be sent out in like a follow-up email or something?
Sure, we'd be happy to share it.
All right, great. So then that'll have all of the links to the videos, the citations, and all of that good stuff in case people want to read further.
Dr. Cooke, Lakeisha says thank you for all of your resources. And Easter, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. She wants to know, or he wants to know, what book recommendations would you suggest?
I'll give you a shameless self-plug, and that would be my book, Information Services to Diverse Populations. And then for things that I haven't written, there are any number of books. One that I'm thinking of is called Not Light But Fire. Let me see if I can type that into the chat box. And these are some titles that will help you not only learn more, but help us to really have these hard conversations. So Not Light by Fire, anything by Gerald Wing Sue, typing that in the box too. Those are the ones that come to mind immediately about recommendations for getting further into this work.
Dr. Cooke, if you could make sure that you click on all participants, that way we all receive.
So it says, oh, I'm doing all attendees. Apologies. Okay, hold on. Okay, so Not Light by Fire, but Fire, and then also Dr. Gerald Wing Sue.
Any other questions? Give just one quick second just to Okay, I don't see any more, so we will end. And thank you so much, Dr. Cooke. Thank you again for being here today. And I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact your state library's continuing education coordinator. And if you have any more, I'll also forward those questions to Dr. Cooke. And once again, you will receive a survey on this presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that with your feedback. And thanks again for joining us, and be sure to join us again at 3 p.m. for our next concurrent sessions, using universal design to make your library more accessible and inclusive, and the first-hand millennial view. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.